2014. We will set out a prospectus. We will
How's it going?
And we'll let people in Scotland decide.
Experts from the LSE have done some detailed research, and they estimate trade costs between Scotland and the rest of the UK would increase 15% after independence in an optimistic scenario, or 30% in a pessimistic scenario. Are they right, those experts?
I'm not looking at the report that you're talking about there, so I want to look at that in detail. It's the report, I think I recall, it was a very, very narrowly based assessment, and it didn't take account of the wider benefits of independence to Scotland's economy. Now, what you've got to remember...
You've got your own costs, though, if you're going to undermine theirs, surely you should do the maths yourself.
With the greatest respect, Kieran, I'm not undermining it. You're quoting things to me that you've got in front of you in an iPad there right now that I don't have in front of me.
Nobody ever said to you, Sturgeon, frankly, candidly, I wish we had this information, or just a bit of information, about what independence might mean for Scotland's economy. Because I hear it a lot. I don't know if you have an idea.
Yeah, I think people rightly expect to have that, just as we had it in 2014 before they voted. Yes, they rightly expect to have that before they're asked to vote again. Well, look, Kieran, we're in a global pandemic. The Growth Commission, while the underlying approach of the Growth Commission is one that I fully endorse and sign up to, the figures in it are completely out of date, because in the period since that was published, we've undergone a global pandemic. The fiscal position of the UK and most countries across the world has been turned upside down. So we'll do these things in the proper, ordered way. People will have not just the detail that you're talking about, but the vision of taking the future of our country into our own hands, not having it determined by Johnson and his Brexiteers.
Mr. Sturgeon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, a record 4.7 million people were waiting for routine operations and procedures in England in February, the highest figure since records began in 2007. Almost 390,000 of those patients have been waiting for over a year to start treatments. Compare that to the previous year, when just 1,600 people were waiting that long. Charities, health organisations say it shows the catastrophic impact of the pandemic on the NHS services, from urgent cancer treatment to admissions to A&E. A new study from Oxford University has found that the risk of developing a blood clot after contracting COVID-19 is 8 times higher than the risk involved with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. In the study of over 500,000 coronavirus patients, the risk of a blood clot was reported to be around 100 times higher than normal after infection. The UK's medical regulator has said that the AstraZeneca vaccine is still safe and effective and will save many thousands of lives, although people under 30 will be offered an alternative jab. A senior Public Health England official has warned people to keep following the COVID guidelines as restrictions are eased, saying a dangerous wave of infections is sweeping countries on our doorstep. The latest 24-hour government figures show 117,000 people received their first dose of the COVID vaccine yesterday. Almost 350,000 people had their second dose. 32.5 million people have now received their first dose of the vaccine, and 8.5 million people have been given both doses. And there have been another 2,500 new cases in the UK. At the same time, there's been more than 200,000 COVID infections in India in a single day. The country has seen a huge spike in infections over the past few weeks, which has prompted the government to halt exports of COVID vaccines produced in India. Hospitals say there are severe shortages of beds and oxygen, with some extra space found in hotels. And a top official from the World Health Organization says there have now been more than 1 million deaths from COVID, warning the situation remains serious, with some 1.6 million new cases reported each week in the region. And the number of people dying with the virus in France has now passed 100,000, making it the 8th country in the world to record that many deaths. The country was put back into partial lockdown at the beginning of this month in an effort to control surging cases.
Now, in the barricaded buildings behind me here in Minneapolis, the 2 cases of black men who died at the hands of police key turns. One that could have repercussions across America is a former police officer, Derek Chauvin, for the murder of George Floyd. The defense has now rested and the court is adjourned until closing statements on Monday. The newer case is of former police officer Kim Potter, who is due to appear any moment charged with second-degree manslaughter for the fatal shooting of Dante Wright on Sunday. Protesters who've been on the streets again say she should face murder charges, while Mr. Wright's family lawyer called it an intentional, deliberate and unlawful use of force. A warning, some viewers may find part of this report distressing. At the spot where Dante Wright died, a vigil for a family still in shock. The beleaguered mayor, Mike Elliott, struggling for control over how his community is policed, joined them in their grief. What must it be like to do this in public? The family asking both for privacy and to be heard.
My brother, just being in his presence uplifted my spirit. I love my brother so much, and this is unbelievable. And I can't never see him in person again. Can never give my brother, give him a hug. They took him from me. They took him from us.
Last night, the protesters were back, but with the charging of the officer Kim Potter with manslaughter, it was quieter. After curfew, they started detaining people. The aggressive use of gas, spray, and less lethal rounds this week drew criticism from the mayor. But his only control is over local police, and this is now handled by outside agencies who are not listening.
There is a massive breakdown of trust here. The community do not trust the police. Do you trust the police as an African American man?
In the United States of America, we all know that there are great disparities in policing. We know that, somebody's pulled over because for whatever reason, and if they happen to be black, there's a significantly higher chance that there will be a use of force and potentially end up in death.
But there is a massive democratic crisis here because the police are not listening to you when you're the elected one.
Our department is following the directions of the mayor and the directions of the city council.
But there are outside law enforcement agencies that you don't have control of.
The sheriff has, stepped in and assumed command of operations just last night, and that is a policing power that they hold.
Kim Potter appears in court by Zoom today in her first hearing. As a few yards away in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, the defense rested.
You understand that you have remain silent.
I'm going to try this again.
Not to give evidence or be cross-examined.
Have you made a decision today whether you intend to testify or whether you intend to invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege?
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
Is this your decision not to testify?
Yes, it is.
And now a new killing from Monday, with footage from police body cameras just released, raising questions about policing, about who gets shot, and under what circumstances. Miles Jackson had been brought to hospital when police discovered warrants for his arrest, and in a pat-down, a concealed weapon. In the struggle in which he was tasered, a shot is fired, but it isn't clear why. Jackson claims the gun is on the ground, and he's afraid.
I'm just scared if I move, you're not going to shoot. Put your hand on your head. I'm just scared, guys.
In the final struggle, it is again unclear what happens, but the massive number of shots fired is under question.
Keep your hand up! I swear to God, man! Change the tape again.
What happened in Ohio will be for another day. Right now, all eyes are here on what happens next week when the fate of Derek Chauvin and the legacy of George Floyd are placed in the hands of 12 jurors in Minneapolis. It is not an overstatement to say the future of racial justice across America hangs in the balance. Of course, unlike in Britain, where it wouldn't be allowed, everything in court has been watched by people across America on television, and the evidence has been analysed and debated. A lot of people, and almost every one of those protesters on the streets this week, have already made up their minds. So the weight of expectation on this jury next week is enormous. And the fears of what could happen if it goes another way, and remember, all it takes is one juror, are plain to see. The National Guard is on the streets already, and the buildings are all boarded up. A lot of people are watching anxiously, with so much at stake. John.
Now, Buckingham Palace has revealed plans for the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh on Saturday. The details were announced as Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall made their first public appearance since the Duke's death. Plans are in accordance with the Duke's wishes, although they will take into account current public health guidelines. The guest list of 30 includes relatives and their spouses, other than one seat, which has been reserved for Prince Philip's carriage-driving partner, Countess Mountbatten of Burma. The Duke's 4 children will walk alongside the coffin, which will be placed on a modified Land Rover, which the Duke himself helped design. The event will also mark Prince Andrew's first appearance at an official royal event since stepping down from royal duties over his friendship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
Now, a year after it was first introduced, the landmark Violence Against Women and Girls Bill is back in the House of Commons, where the government has accepted the majority of suggestions made by the Lords. They did, however, water down an attempt to include repeat domestic abusers and stalkers on a national crime database in England and Wales. An amendment had suggested that they should be added to the high-risk offenders register in the same way as violent and sexual criminals. And a warning, this report by Andy Pop may upset some viewers.
My mum was such a big character, very bubbly. There was never a dull moment, let's put it that way. So I'm very, very, very lucky to have had, the mum I did. And even though I only had her for 7 years, she's taught me so many things that will last a lifetime.
It was January 2018, and Cheryl Gabriel Hooper was arriving home with her 14-year-old daughter, Georgia. She had recently left her abusive husband, who had secretly attached a tracker to her car and was stalking her.
He turned up to our address and pulled behind us, blocking us on the drive just as we arrived. At which point he got out of the car and started banging on the driver's side window with what I believed was a piece of scaffolding or a spade. Got out of the car, and I just thought if I can move him out the way of the car, then at least my mum can get out because she was trapped at this point. But before I even had a chance to get to him to try and move him, he had shot through the window and he shot my mum twice with a 12-bore shotgun.
Georgia witnessed her mum's brutal murder by her stepfather, who had a previous conviction after breaking into his ex-partner's house with a knife and threatening to kill her. She's trying to bring meaning to her loss and campaigning for repeat domestic abusers or stalkers to be put on the national register where they'd be monitored more closely.
I completely believe that my mum would still be alive if it was that register was here. He did have a previous conviction against a previous partner, and he should have been monitored more closely after that. The fact that he is allowed to still have a shotgun license is confusing to me. We have a sex offenders register. Why don't we have a domestic abuse register? We know it's just as deadly and damaging as sex offences are.
In the aftermath of a murder through domestic violence, all too often a pattern of violent and disturbing behaviour emerges, of multiple victims over time with little oversight to protect them. Supporters of the register say that a coordinated approach and proper monitoring is desperately needed to allow a full picture to be known before rather than after someone is killed.
The landmark domestic abuse bill is back in the Commons today after changes were made to it in the Lords. The government has agreed to 86 of the 98 proposed changes, but crucially, the proposed register and that monitoring that Georgia and so many others want through the national system MAPA is not one of them. The government say they'll issue a new strategy to manage abusers in a year.
The government believes that creating a new MAPA category for high-harm domestic abuse and stalking perpetrators would bring in added complexity to the MAPA framework without compensating benefits. The Criminal Justice Act 2003 already provides for serial and high-harm offenders to be managed under MAPA. The real issue is not therefore the statutory framework, but how it is applied in practice.
I think it's hugely disappointing. They tabled an amendment in lieu of ours, which is just saying, well, we're just strengthening guidance. And that's just not acceptable. It's a backstep, quite frankly. I've worked with families bereaved. I've reviewed case after case where the lessons to be learned are that it's a pattern of behaviour, where perpetrators don't just wake up one day and kill. We want to make sure that these violent men are visible and accountable and responsible.
The domestic abuse bill brings hope to those at risk, but the voting down today of the proposed register means the battle for campaigners like Georgia goes on, not just to protect others like her mum, but in her words, to make her not
Still can't get it working.
I spoke to the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence.
I might not be able to do it tonight, but
And I asked her
which is going to be annoying.
what she thought about the amendments to the bill.
There's a couple of real areas of concern where I think that the government is missing a trick that these amendments would solve. One of them is about serial offenders, people, the most violent offenders who go on to stalk and abuse women after women after women. And in cases like the case of Holly Gazzard, who was murdered, or Jane Clough, who was murdered, both their murderers were known to authorities who had been perpetual abusers and stalkers of other people. And currently the system just does not monitor and manage those people and leaves, I'm afraid to say, leaves us as the public unsafe. So we were seeking amendments to make a stronger system of monitoring and management of those highest harm offenders that the government have pushed back on. We will see where we get to that over the next couple of weeks. The other area where the government is massively, I think, leaving a huge group of victims out, and that is the migrant victims of domestic abuse who are just simply not included in this bill.
As far as I understand, Jessica, something like 89,000 offenders are already on the existing registers for terrorists and for sexual offenders. I'm assuming that it would mushroom to a much bigger size. Is the government's point here that they simply don't have the resources to enforce that law?
That very well may be the government's point, but that's not one that they're making. That is, I imagine, the actual reality of the situation. But they're never going to say that to the mother and father of Holly Gazzard. They're never going to say to Zoe Dronfield, who was left for dead by her perpetrator, who had offended against 13 women previously. They're never going to say to her, sorry, we just don't have the resources to make sure that women like you are safe. So